gavelled in, my co-chair, Ms. Bakari.
Thank you.
In all seriousness, welcome to IG. This is our second meeting of the month. Last meeting was with me, Mr. Newton, and Mr. Eggleston, where we kind of went over the legislative agenda. At least we took input from the committee and council. I think that's what we're going to follow up with here today. Starting off, what we usually do is go around the room and introduce ourselves. So we can start to my far left and work our way on around.
Hey, Lacey Williams, Equity, Mobility, Immigrant Integration.
Elena Price with Equity, Mobility, Immigrant Integration.
Emily Yaffe with Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration.
Federico Rios, same group.
Pearson Libby.
Deb Tassie Bush, try to get budget.
Just McDowell, Kilpatrick Townsend.
Dana Fenton with the City Manager's Office.
Christian Holmes, Charlotte Communications.
Braxton Winston, co-chair.
Tarek Bakari, co-chair.
Mark and Eggleston, committee member.
Matt Newton, committee member, District 5.
Patrick Baker, city attorney.
Maureen Gillespie, Charlotte East.
Mr. Mitchell, who's a committee member, will be here with us shortly, but since this is a Monday, everybody's got a lot of things going on. We wanted to kind of get it started. So I guess we can start, Mr. Fenton, if you want to just go over the agenda.
If you don't mind, Mr. Co-Chair, I'll just jump in. The way we'll do it, and this will give Smudgy time to be here, Dana's going to take us through item number 2 on the agenda, which is kind of the process for anyone who might have not been part of this process for the last couple cycles that we've done it, and how the state and federal legislative agenda process works. And then we're going to then jump into the federal and then the state agendas.
That's not yours?
Let's go ahead and answer it. Hand it over here. Hello?
That's quite a ring right there.
And then we'll go through those. And again, today's objective builds on the work of the committee last week, where there's a laundry list of items up for proposed adoption, both state and federal. And Dana will cover this in more depth, but today's actions are to go through and as a committee vote either 3, 4, or 5 committee members in favor of something to bring it to the full council in the next strategy session, or 3, 4, or 5 members oppose bringing it, and then it either goes into our parking lot or we take no position on it. So go ahead, Mr.
Carr,
Yeah,
or
sir.
Mr. Fenton.
Yep.
Process question. If there's something here that we want additional information on, are we able to get that and then put, I don't recall from last year, from the process standpoint, could I say, I'd like to get more information on this before I was to say that I think it should go forward as part of the legislative agenda? Could we do that and then either in committee or in the full council, then obviously we could add it later at the full council, but how would we go about that? Or should we just vote these things up or down today and then get more information as it goes to council?
Probably a little bit of everything. You could ask for more information. We will try to get that for you. And of course, whenever anything goes to the council as a committee proposal, the council has the prerogative to change that proposal. So they can add things to it, they can take things away from it, they can modify what the goal would be.
Are you imagining that this discussion as far as internal to the committee today, kind of putting a bow on it, and then the discussion will pick up in council? We're not going to come back at the next intergovernmental meeting and still be talking about this.
One caveat on that, you do have another meeting scheduled for the 17th of February. The adoption of these agendas is not scheduled until the 24th of February. So it's very possible that in case of any questions, the mayor could send this back to the next committee meeting to make a final recommendation for the 24th.
I was just going to say, I think we can be flexible, but I think if I think back on how we've done it the last couple cycles, up or down would be cleanest. Because as of last week, right, hopefully the takeaway was if there was some unknown piece of information that we didn't have, that would have given us the time to then follow up on it. We'll see in the depth if there are some things that weren't answered. If something is very compelling that's net new information, I think we can, as a group, discuss a contingent approval to go to council based on another piece of information possibly being found. But hopefully that won't happen, given that last week those follow-ups would have been done.
Jump into it.
Thank you, Mr. Bakari. You did a great job summarizing what I was going to talk about here.
Sorry.
The process that I'm going to present to you is one that was really started last year. It was really designed by the dearly departed Jason Kay.
May he rest in peace.
So, three of you at least, Mr. Bakari, Mr. Eccleston, Mr. Mitchell, you've seen this process before. And it's simply, and I'm just going to go right to the meat of it here. There are actually, let me go to the next page, what the sorting process actually is. I can go back to the other slides if I need to. The first step would be to have informal committee discussion on the issues that are recommended or that are out there for the federal legislative agenda, and then also those for the state legislative agenda. The second step is we'll report back to you what the results are of that discussion. We'll try to capture it through very quick handwriting we'll be doing on our presentation here. And then the committee itself would vote on the comprehensive results. And just to give you just a little summary, let me get back to the previous slides here. Right now, you have before you 4 federal requests and 5 state requests. There were 2 that Ms. Watlington brought up last week, but in subsequent discussions, she decided to withdraw those. We do have the request. They are enumerated in the attachments. We have a second attachment here called Federal and State Legislative Request, which you have at your places on the dais. It's part of your agenda packet. And then, as Mr. Bakari said, it would be sorted into the agenda, into the parking lot, or into no position. And then getting to the next page in terms of the sorting categories going further for the federal or state legislative agendas, being that this is a short session year, probably the optimal number of issues for each agenda is 3. That doesn't mean you can't have more. I'm just saying that's the optimal number of positions or issues, and then we would actively monitor or advocate for those issues. Then you have the parking lot as what you, just the way you described it, Mr. Bakari, and then of course you have the no position, no likelihood of success, stakeholders not unified, et cetera, et cetera. And then going to the 2 slides up, we have here on the federal request, these show enumerated each of the requests out there, and then just have on the side there, agenda, parking lot, or no position. And finally, we did the same for the state side as well. And Mr. Chairman, that is all I have, except what at the very end, the next steps, of course, once you decide on the committee proposed agendas today, that'll first appear before City Council next week, the strategy session, and then there's an action review on February 10th and then a meeting of adoption for February 24th. And Mr. Chairman, that's all I have.
Well, thank you. If you can go back to that slide with the federal requests, we will go through those first 4. What we'll do here, we'll go one by one, starting with the affordable housing request, which was made by the city manager. As we go through each individual one, what I'll ask is of the person making this request to kind of give a short synopsis of why this is here and what you're thinking around it. For the managers, we will rely on Mr. Fenton and his explanation. So we can start with affordable housing, if you just want to give us.
Affordable housing, okay, so I guess I get most of the speaking part of
Yes,
the
sir.
federal issues. and state
Your
issues as
show,
well.
Mr. Fenton.
All right, very good. First is affordable housing for the city manager. Essentially, this is the same position as what was approved by the city council for the 2019 federal legislative agenda. It would certainly be a continuation, a strong show of your support for the community development block grant and home investment partnership programs, which, by the way, I remember Mr. Mitchell last month at a meeting said staff doesn't do enough to talk about all the good things that they've been a part of. And this is one where efforts of the past years, not just staff, but also city council and city councils from around the United States, substantial new funding for both CDBG and home programs. And the city manager recommends inclusion of that in the 2020 legislative agenda.
Discussion, Mr. Bakari.
So I think I know the answer to this, and it still stands of, again, this is great work, and CDBG stuff, all that stuff is a continued need. There's no reason for us to not carry this over, right? I mean, I'm just thinking out loud. It's something that we need our delegation to champion.
That's right.
It's going to be something we obviously continually, year after year, want. So this is really more of a standing year over year one, right? There's no reason for us not to, in any year, unless something drastically changes, have this on.
You bring a very good question up, is that probably we have made great strides in reversing what's been happening. You know, this was a diminishing source of revenue for us, or overall for the nation. And so we might reach the natural point where we don't need to include it every year, but we think right now we're still at that point where it's a good idea to have it in there.
Motion included on the agenda.
Second.
Second. Discussion, I actually have a question about that.
Please.
It's been motioned and seconded, so I know you said this is a holdover from 2019, but I also know that we had something on a 2018 legislative agenda federally where we talked about affordable housing. And during that time when we were on the Hill, we were pushing a kind of an idea of a new program, sort of like our Tiger funding around
Right.
transportation. Why is that, why are we still not kind of pushing that? And is this something that I know we're doing a community block grants, but we were also pushing the idea that we need to do things differently.
The idea of a Tiger-type program.
Well, a
for
Tiger-type
housing,
program
yeah,
that way
right.
that affordable housing dollars
Right.
aren't so narrowly distributed that they can only be used in certain areas. But, you know, we know that affordable housing is a neighborhood building initiative that has to include not just units of housing, but transportation, services,
Right.
environmental concerns, this, that, and other. And we were looking for federal help so that we can use assets to apply to a kind of an entire neighborhood approach. And why is that not still there, and should it be on there?
Yeah, it's a great question. That idea didn't gain any traction, unfortunately. And of course, right now, we're kind of at the point where we're in a presidential election year, and it's just not one of those ideas that's been brought up for further discussion this year, unfortunately.
Is that something that might be put in a parking lot or something like that? Because
We
we still
could-
need that, right? It's still our position, that's how we need to build affordable housing,
Certainly,
right?
yeah, we could always, there's always something that we could keep track of, so that we can, just in case it doesn't, were to come up again.
And the other question I had is opportunity zones. I know that's not necessarily directly, the opportunity zones and affordable housing aren't directly related, but there are a lot of concerns that we have, there are a lot of concerns that the community has around development and affordable housing in opportunity zones. Again, I don't have a specific ask or, know where to go with this, and I know that opportunity zones are a function of the executive branch right now, but is this something that we want to, I guess I would ask my committee members.
I think it meets the definition of our parking lot very cleanly, which is where we don't know exactly the action we have, but it's something we want to track, have Dana and staff track, and be ready to move on quickly should something arise or should a new input come. So I think that cleanly fits in that bucket.
And I say opportunity zones in relation to affordable housing. not
If I-
just-
Yeah.
If I can bring up something else
Completely.
with you too, is that the administration has prioritized about 160 federal grant programs for implementation in opportunity zones. That means that additional points will be given when they rate the application. And they have a variety of programs. It's not just transportation infrastructure, but it's also housing. So housing programs in there. So, and that's something that we've just learned about very recently.
I don't think we require any motions or anything, but I'm fully supportive of that being something that I know that Chairman Mitchell and Workforce Development and Business is keeping a close eye on that. I think it makes sense from a legislative agenda and from affordable housing perspective as well.
All right. So there's a motion and a second.
All in favor?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? There you go. Second item on the federal request is immigration reform.
Do you have the slides where you can go to the detailed slide on each of
Yes, I
that?
can.
That
I
way
do.
it just pops
Can
up.
you see there?
And that was brought forward by Mr. Eggleston, along with his work on the ad hoc committee on immigrant relations from last year. So, Mr. Eggleston, if you want to give us a brief synopsis.
Yeah, you can see on the screen, many of you were at many of those meetings, and we discussed it a little bit last week, so I won't belabor the point unless there are any specific questions, but continuing to support things like the H-1B visa program, asylum seekers, temporary protected status, DACA, all recommendations that came forward from that committee and those listening sessions that we had in the community. We have all of our staff here from that department as well, so if there's any specific questions, we can address them. But many of you are part of coming up with these recommendations, so I'm going to assume that you're familiar with them and comfortable with them.
Yes.
And I'm going to make the motion that we include this in our federal legislative agenda.
Second.
Discussion?
So, again, I think the work of the committee and the outcomes they arrived at, we all arrived at, I think are great. I guess my clarification question is, so if we put this on the federal agenda, much like we did kind of reactively last year, but last year was more of this topic as a whole is important to us. It'll be similar to the conversation we had last year, but now it will be more centered around, we have followed up since then, done this work across the community, and here are the outcomes and outputs that aren't necessarily in our city council's purview to be able to go and ask you to do something that then we would do, but it's clearly something that we're going to use our engagement with the community to relay to you. Is that a fair, I'm just trying to visualize
Yeah.
what our meeting is like when we go.
I mean, I think the definition of our legislative agenda is things we don't have full control over, but are asking for assistance with based on what we see on the ground locally. And so I think what we've identified here are opportunities based on the feedback we got in those community sessions for things that could be impactful, but things that aren't going to be used as a political football, or they're not going to burn the bridges between Charlotte and Washington. So, I mean, you know, certainly could we have probably asked for some other stuff that might have been a little bit more politically risky? I suppose so, but I think part of the strategy was we'd rather be successful with things that can be impactful, and I think, and if Mr. Rios, Ms. Yaffe have anything they want to add on that, but I think we pick things here where we think we can get wins, and that those wins will actually be meaningful to the people in the community.
I do think that, you know, if we put this on the legislative agenda, I think the words comprehensive immigration reform need to be on there. And it's fine that we have these, how we've broken it down in terms of points in the comprehensive vision that are important to us. But again, comprehensive immigration reform, it is something that is not in itself, in terms of a term, political up in Washington. Like, everybody understands what that means. Everybody's vision is a bit different. That's where things become political. But the idea that we need to change the whole system is something that I think we should and could get behind.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with that. I think if you think about, and for those who weren't in the room with us last year on this trip, we had a little heartburn. I personally had a little heartburn of adding this. I was very cognizant of, to the points just made, while we all agree that it needs to be fixed, the problem coming in and alienating or upsetting someone that maybe now that we couldn't get them to work on something that was closer into our city council wheelhouse. I think that was the furthest thing from actually what happened. I think we had great, whether it was with our Republican or Democrat colleagues up there, conversations where everyone completely, I was shocked, in fact, how completely everyone agreed that comprehensive immigration reform as a term was the thing that needed to happen. Now, I think the takeaway was, what were they thinking in their heads when they each individually heard that from us and they said it? And I think this is an amazing second step to continue that work, which is, here are some things, not just randomly picked by us, but gathered from the community that isn't as politically divisive as maybe some things could be, but shows a bipartisan nature and lower hanging fruit in some things. And I'm prepared to support this and show the local bipartisan nature of bringing that to them.
Sounds like you'd like to change the label on this to comprehensive immigration reform.
Well,
I accept your friendly amendment.
yeah. Well, I'll ask my committee. It seems like it is accepted, but what I will point out one thing. I don't know if the bullet points as we represent on this slide are comprehensive immigration reform.
But I think comprehensive immigration reform would
that
indicate
pigeonhole us?
that we've said, we don't think that these four things are somehow the silver bullet for a much larger issue. We think that locally here, but probably locally, a lot of other places, these would be impactful, but it doesn't mean that it's a comprehensive list. So comprehensive immigration reform could be, these are the 4 things we've identified now.
Yes.
They are not an exhaustive list of what comprehensive immigration reform would entail, but they are what we think could be more short-term accomplishments.
So perhaps something like comprehensive immigration reform with immediate focus on
Yes.
these bullet points.
Works for me.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. We'll go on to transportation infrastructure as requested by the city manager.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is a carryover position from 2019. It contains positions related to transit funding, which is very important this year because there is a federal surface transportation reauthorization bill that's due to expire, and the Congress is looking at what levels of funding they should put into that program that includes transit for the next 5-6 years. Airports, highways, and passenger rail, same as last year, especially at the airport, we are seeking federal funding, a commitment of federal funding for the 4th parallel runway. And modernized and sustainable infrastructure. This was one we looked at we added this after the Strategic Energy Action Plan was adopted by the City Council. And what's interesting here is that we are seeing in some reauthorization bills for infrastructure, including the transportation bill, provisions in there for federal funding for what I guess we call climate change initiatives, that type of thing, resiliency. That's a word that's been used down east in North Carolina since the hurricanes of 2016 and 2018. So, and that's all I have to say on that.
Can I get a motion from the
So
committee?
moved.
Second.
Any discussion? No discussion, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Ayes have it, and the 4th and last item is the Urban Area Security Initiative, was brought to us by the city manager's office.
Mr. Winston, quick question.
Yes, Ms. Davis.
Mr. Fenton, your inclusion, and I'm glad Mr. McDowell's back there as well, your inclusion of the idea that 3 is an optimal number. I mean, we've got 4 things here that I think we're all going to agree on, 3 of which were brought by the city manager. So is it safe to assume neither of you have any discomfort with us having 4 things? I mean,
No discomfort.
but I just want to make sure that knowing there were 4 things in here for the federal agenda and you putting something in the presentation about 3, that there wasn't an encouragement to try to pare down the list in any way.
If I might, Mr. Chair, I would say that there's a difference, I think, between some that are more carryover and showcase of like, hey, quick update, you've heard this from us year over year, and net new ones where we're like, okay, here's something, we haven't really talked to you. I would make that assumption, is if you agree, Mr. Fenton.
Kind of 2 and 2 halves, like 2 new issues and then 2 things that just, hey, we still care. All right.
Correct.
One of the suggestions that I had about this urban area security initiative is, well, we do focus on our legislators in District 9, District 12. I think it might be helpful if we try to outreach to other folks that are involved in this.
In the UASI program?
Yeah, and
Yeah, we've tried to get the other counties that are part of this. It's a 10-county region outside, it's 9 counties outside of Mecklenburg.
Yeah.
And there's about, I think, 6 or 7 members of the House of Representatives, in addition to R2, or actually including R2. So we need those counties to reach out to those representatives. We have put that word out through Mr. Graham, or Chief Graham, to those counties that they need to reach out to their representatives.
well, is this something that why wouldn't we also be reaching out to these legislators?
Because I think those legislators will be more receptive to one of their own counties calling up, as opposed to the city of Charlotte, which is not represented by those legislators. Doesn't mean that we can't talk to them about it at some point, but initially, those counties have to make that outreach to those legislators.
Don't we talk to a lot of their legislators on the federal trip? I mean, even though we go outside of our own county's delegation,
Congressman Hudson, but,
and
but you
it's the
have-
same agenda.
but you have
We talk to
a couple other legislators there too.
Sure,
I think
sure.
there would be more value,
Yeah.
more bang for the buck if those other counties were to reach out.
Okay.
I think that's also something we as committee members and council members can talk amongst ourselves about, is
Sure.
figure out something.
Motion to add UASI to the federal legislative agenda.
Second.
Second.
Any discussion? Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it.
Okay, we're going to move on to the state legislative agenda now. There are 5 items on this. 3 are from the city manager and 2 are from Councilmember Winston. We'll start with affordable housing. Do I have,
Motion to add affordable housing services.
Second.
Dana, would you, as a first update, clarify for everyone what this is?
Yes, this is simply, last year, you were looking for some legislation to help mitigate the impact of displacements and gentrification out there. And we were able to get some legislation put into a bill that was introduced in the House. It passed the House, and what this would do is allow the city council to provide relocation assistance and rental subsidies for people facing these issues, both low and moderate incomes. Right now, we don't have clear authority that we can provide that assistance for moderate income persons. And that, again, that's part of a bill that's already passed the House, and right now it's in the Senate Rules Committee.
Any conversation?
Where are Ross and Adcock from?
Stephen Ross is from Burlington, Alamance County, and Representative Adcock is from Wake County.
And so,
And they are the co-chairs, by the way, of the caucus that's set up for cities, the city caucus. They're former, I think they're former council members from their cities. Representative Adcock, who I think was on the town of Cary Council, and Steve Ross used to be the mayor of Burlington. And by the way, that's a bipartisan. Steve Ross is a Republican, and Representative Adcock is a Democrat.
Thought I let that roll. Any other comments? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. Let's move on to the second one. This is Councilmember Winston's contribution, and it is in local control. Since this is a new one, rather than start with the motion, maybe you give us an update real quick, and then we'll call for a.
yeah, and I'll call for a tag team from Mr. Fenton. If I get anything wrong, maybe he can give us a little bit of history civics lesson. But this really comes from some of the things that we want to do here in Charlotte, and some of the problems that we're dealing with that are different than other parts of North Carolina. We often get into these situations where we could, if we were given the ability to have more control over our local democracy, that we could put common sense policies and approaches to the problems that we have. So I would like to broach that conversation with our state legislators, and starting with our local delegation, of finding ways that we can get more local control over issues and policy making, so that we can really speed up the services that we provide to our citizens.
So maybe we first go to the city attorney. I think we all have seen many instances with specific topics where having a local approach or a local bill to enable us to move towards something differently than maybe a more rural part of the state makes sense. But then there's local control and home rule versus Dillon. Maybe you can give us an update there.
So I was, I appreciate you bringing that point. I was going to bring up the idea of being targeted with an approach on a specific issue versus a general loosening of the strings, if you will. I am familiar with some of the national work that's being done at the National League of Cities And we're also taking it up with IMLA, the International Municipal Lawyers Association group, in terms of looking at the home rule versus the quote-unquote Dillon's rule kind of state. In terms of, where you are here and kind of using your own categories, your sorting categories of timing and environment not opportune, no present likelihood of success, and I'm not sure where council is, but I mean, this is going to be a challenge for a general broad approach at home rule for local governments. I think the environment would be a challenge, and I'm not even addressing the substance of the request, but in terms of moving this on to your delegation, I do think that it would be a challenge to do something general, but if there were some specific things that you were looking at, that would probably give you more likelihood of at least having folks, a broader group hearing what you have to say, as opposed to just moving on. And that's all anecdotal. I don't have any empirical studies of what happens when you put something like this out in front of folks.
More comments from the
Yeah,
committee?
and I definitely hear what Mr. Baker is saying. Some specific, the number one specific topic I would think of is the idea around inclusionary zoning. And the ability to do more work there. The fact, correct me if I'm wrong, North Carolina is a strange place. In some ways, there are some home rule characteristics that we have. That is, of course, until the legislator preempts us. And then we are even stricter than Dillon rule state. So we fall on both sides of the extremes here. So really focusing on, hey, in general, the broader speaking, if we have this ability to be a home rule state already, we are looking to deal with the issues of Charlotte. How do we change the climate, change the environment, so that we are not getting preempted out of giving actual solutions for the betterment of Charlotte and therefore the betterment of North Carolina.
It's a big question.
And again, I recognize that, as also said, it's might not, and this and probably the next one probably is not the cleanest idea ready for legislative action right now. But I do believe that part of our legislative agenda is to start, continue, and ultimately, if we do get legislation, is to finish a conversation with a different legislative body. And I would like to at least start having that conversation that, hey, this is a priority for us, and this is something that we're going to need to figure out moving forward.
Councilman Newton.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from my colleague is that this is about planting the seed, right? Getting the conversation started. Certainly we exist for a reason. Raleigh can't do it all. And to that extent, I think, we're on the ground locally, just like any other local government. I hear our city attorney and Dana's position that, this needs to be a broader perspective and approach. But I think someone has to, get the conversation started at some point. So I'm supportive of this, pending any other kind of unforeseen argument that I'm not aware of.
Mr. Eggleston.
So I want to clarify to my colleagues and anyone else that both the local control and marijuana legalization are things that I am principally supportive of, but I, at this time, can't and won't vote to put either in this year's state legislative agenda because, to the point that was made by Mr. Baker, putting something in here that has, I would argue, is a 0% chance of success, particularly in the short session of 2020 under the current leadership we have in Raleigh. We might have local support. I think, to Mr. Newton's point, we need to plant a seed. I think the seed planting is not done by making this a top priority of our lobbyists to fight for in Raleigh in a year where they can't win that fight, but it's to have the conversations with our delegation and have somebody who's the champion the way that Representative Alexander is on the marijuana issue and trying to move the ball on that in Raleigh. I think that, again, and I agree with Mr. Baker, if we have a specific ask in terms of local control, I think that's something we could have some success with more short term, but sending our lobbyists on a futile mission in a session where they can't get it done, to me is not, it erodes the effectiveness of the other things that are on our legislative agenda. So while these are both things that I support, they're not things I can vote to put on the legislative agenda today.
Councilman Winston.
Yeah, I think we had this conversation also last year around immigration. Again, I think this is, I agree with a lot of what Mr. Eggleston said in terms of the ability of having a shot of getting legislation approved right now. But again, like I said, I think the way I look at our legislative agenda is to do three things, any one of three things: to start, continue, or finish a conversation. I think if we take positions on things like this as a city, it also gives us the ability to go out to other municipalities, other governing bodies, to have that conversation, to say, hey, this is something that is important. We are taking some of the political risk of bringing this conversation to the forefront. Let's have this conversation together. Let's make this a priority for our state, so that we can get some of these big changes done, and not just have yelling going on in the wind in the media and on social media and whatnot.
I hear all the points. I naturally am predisposed to where Councilman Eggleston was talking about. There's no chance. In fact, it does further to, I think, alienate the people that we're going to sit down in front of when they hear that and they hear the other things. But even putting all that aside, if you just look at the messaging and the success factor that we could have, on one side we could say generically, let us have more autonomy, like on everything, no matter what the topic is when it pops up. We don't want you to come over the top and tell us we can't. Or, I think to the other point, we say, here are one or two things that are specific examples of that. And we start moving down that point. I think that plants just as much of a seed that you're talking about for the conversation, but in a more productive manner. One example, and something I'm going to bring up when we got to the end of this, unfortunately, I wasn't here the first time, and we may not get to that point of adding it now, but I think it's really important, is very specifically the conversations we've been having. When you and I went to meet with the DA and others, and they show us and walk us through this paper-filled filing cabinet room, and then we say, well, why can't you do that? Because right now there is a statewide mandate that all places have to go digital together. And having a small rural county in their DA versus a top 16 city in the nation and their paper-based processes are two very different things. And I don't think we're going to alienate anyone by saying a local bill is warranted here, and that's why. Versus going and saying generically, let us make these kinds of decisions. I think that seed is planted, and I'm of the mindset of I'd like to go find a couple things, and maybe let's get flexible and nimble on bringing those up. Maybe in this very legislative agenda, like that example, and then maybe save and let that be a nonchalant seed for those of us who want to have that.
So I'll make an ask. I receive what both of y'all are saying. I think there's wisdom there. I would ask, let's send this to full council so we can have this conversation, and maybe there's some specific things. That's a perfect example of the DA. I think of inclusionary zoning. I also think about, as we're dealing with our transportation options and looking at how state-maintained roads are serviced, and for instance, what keeps coming up? Lines on the road and streetlights, around I-77, or thinking about changes to Providence Road. Those are things that are very difficult for us to handle because, again, those are state-maintained roads. But if we can, perhaps these are the conversations that we can have as a full council and whittle it down to something that makes sense.
And if I could, I'll hand it to you next, Mr. Newton. Just if I could say, so let me make a proposal on that. Instead of sending local control, why don't we do one of these flexible things where we've said in this room 3 specific examples why local control isn't a political posturing thing. It's something that we know we need. Staff would need to scramble, but I would be supportive of saying around criminal justice reform, system-wise, particularly the items that are in our short list now. We've got to scramble and get more of them in, but we know records, going digital from records is one simple one. You've mentioned state-maintained roads and having a little more, I don't know if it's autonomy or authority or if it's just partnership and leverage And then 3, you mentioned something about, which I think could be edgy, but if we want to be edgy and find middle ground, inclusionary zoning.
Yeah.
So we come with 3 specific things that we know are about more control without making it about local control.
I got a process question for Mr. Fenton.
Sure, go ahead.
Mr. Fenton, could something at the council discussion potentially from left field be added to the legislative agenda there that maybe we didn't even discuss in the committee?
Oh, sure, yes, it can be.
Right. So, I mean, to me, that's, I could live with Mr. McCarty's idea, or I could live with the idea of us identifying what those things are later with it not necessarily moving out of committee, but it coming from the dais during the council discussion. My concern with sending it out today, while I don't think today's meeting is probably drawing a whole lot of public attention, looking at page 3 and the consideration we're supposed to take on whether something produces a disadvantageous result for the city, if it goes forward to a full council meeting with the city is discussing trying to take over control locally and overrule, home rule or something, I mean, who knows how that gets twisted and who knows how that's viewed. To me, there's a concern of a disadvantageous result for the city when it goes into a more public forum than a lowly committee meeting.
Mr. McCarty, I would just add that I agree with what Mr. Eggleston has to say. And also, you don't have the stakeholders around the state unified on this. The way to go about trying to get something like this started is to go through the North Carolina League of Municipalities. They have an advocacy goals process every 2 years. It begins this July. And that's where you can at least get, you might put something in there, and you could get other city council members from around the state to discuss this very issue. And furthermore, I don't see how any legislation like that would go through this year. First of all, you have restrictions on statewide legislation that you can introduce. So I just don't see how anything like this would even be remotely successful.
Let me go to Mr. Newton.
Yes, those are great points, Dana. I just wanted to also maybe underscore the point here too that with local control, maybe we start to streamline the process. We save time and money. I can look at minimum housing standards, which we have yet to cover. But we're talking about extending the authority, I mean, this is right here, extending the authority to local governments, right, to conduct testing for enforcement remediation. Much like some of the other points that my colleagues have brought up, these are things that we wouldn't have to concern ourselves with in the future if we were to accomplish just this one goal. And so I think not to say that this is something that, we move forward on, today or this year, but maybe over time in the future, it's something that will streamline the process, be more time saving, more cost productive for everyone, us and Raleigh.
Last thing, and we can call a question. You know how I feel about the way things have been done and the way things need to be done. I think, again, we need to utilize our bully pulpit where we can and push the conversation. I would say we should talk about this issue of local control, but if we framed it perhaps in the way we are going about our comprehensive immigration reform, is where we name it quite clearly of what we want overall, but then hone in on some of these specific things to set the example, because the way things have been going aren't working, and we want to get to a place where they do work for us. We need to say that. I think we need to find a way to craft that argument, probably not as crude as it is right here, right now. But I think I would want us to give at least our council a chance to weigh in to how important this is to us in our organization.
So here's what I'd recommend to our committee here, which is we certainly, Dana has shown us, and I think we've experienced, that when we get to the end after full council of a vote, any individual council member who wanted to bring something specific up can be heard. We're going to allow them to be heard, so that happens there. But I also agree with Councilman Eggleston in that it sends a different message, us sending something like that out of committee to council. So I would recommend that we not send this out, but we use the time between now and then for Councilman Winston to maybe refine some of the wording in this, maybe based on some of the conversations we've had, get more specific or generic about elements of it, and then we'll make sure you have an opportunity to do that in front of full council, so that it can be voted on there, and then,
Take a vote.
I'm going to make a motion to send my legislative agenda amendment to full council.
But I'll second that.
Okay, all in favor?
All right.
All opposed? All right, next, marijuana legalization, that is Councilman Winston's as well.
So, again, this is coming out of specifically a couple weeks ago, we were presented by CMPD about our evidence-based approaches to crime reduction and reducing violent crime. One of the hot spots that was pointed out was I-85 and Sugar Creek. And a lot of those crimes, a lot of those arrests emanated from marijuana sales. Both of the amounts of trafficking and as well as petty small amounts. And, you know, we know that policing this is not going to solve this problem. What you have is contraband that should actually be on a market. We see this in different parts of the world, different parts of the country, and really the laws of economics. If people want things, if they want a plant, they will find a way to purchase that plant. We cannot do this on our own, again, because we do not have home rule. So this is something that we are going to need help from our federal legislation. With that said, with this presentation of evidence-based approaches, our constituents want real action right now. And legalization of recreational marijuana, regulating that, putting it on the market, gives people that are involved in that industry the pathways to deal with things like conflicts with non-payment in a way that the market will take care of it and not street justice. So in the manner of dealing with these crimes that was so prevalent and so in focus, I think this is a real-time, common sense approach to dealing with this issue in our city. And this is where this emanates from. And I think that, again, possibly, we probably won't get that legislation through this session, but it is something that I do believe we should put on the agendas and radars of our legislators, and again, broach that conversation on a statewide basis as we go and talk to different municipalities and different governing bodies.
Mr. Eggleston.
Again, as written, I think it's not, there is zero chance that it gets done this term, but I do agree with Mr. Winston's points on the issue, and frankly, my recommendation would be that we hone in some from just marijuana legalization. While I think that is an ultimate goal, we've got two local legislators who have put forward bills. They've seemingly been ignored mostly, but I think we would be better served to specifically get behind our local delegations' bills that they've put forward and say that we are supportive of our legislators in those efforts. But
Again, like I said, sorry.
Please, yeah.
Again, like I said, while I am supportive of this, I think our support, our willingness to come out might get them to take the next step. But again, I am referencing to what is happening on the street. Neither of these create a market that allows people who want to participate in that market to effectively remediate any kind of misunderstandings, any type of payment options, and it doesn't make moves to build our workforce, which is a priority, and it doesn't necessarily allow us to fully generate more revenue without raising taxes. I think legalization and regulation of recreational marijuana will check all of those boxes, and again, we need to make a bold statement, not move through the minutia and the politics of things that might be better but are not where we actually need to be.
Mr. Eggleston.
Mr. Winston knows I appreciate his frustration with incrementalism. And again, I'm for this. I think it's more of a, we've got to decide, and I probably don't have time to do it today, but philosophically, whether we as individuals should use our bully pulpits to advocate for these issues. If this committee's charge, and maybe this shouldn't be the committee's charge, but if the committee's charge is to identify things where we think there is some likelihood of success and identify things where there is minimal potential damage done by collectively or as a body trying to push for these things, then I think this doesn't fall into that category. If you say things I'd like to have, yes, I agree, but we've got to decide whether those are the metrics we actually decide what goes on our agenda by or not. And if they are, to me, both of these don't necessarily fit the bill.
Yeah, I think my perspective on this is, while maybe this isn't the reality of it, I think the perception of it is people expect us to place the top priorities for the city on our legislative agendas for both the state and the federal approach. And while I know what your response will be, Councilman Winston, on the impacts this could potentially have, I'm not sure everyone is on that page, and I think it would just draw a lot of eyes towards a topic that I could think of 2 or 3 more that maybe aren't on this right now that could be, that the general public would view that there. So my recommendation, and we'll go to you to close it out, but my recommendation would be, this feels something like that could be on a parking lot with a request for a study to be done or something, and that study is directed towards the impact it would have on this broader criminal justice system and the problems that we're having and we're trying to approach, rather than it be thrown onto our legislative agenda to go speak to, quite frankly, probably a majority of folks that we'd be bringing it to that would not naturally find support for it. So, Councilman Winston.
I would say that this definitely checks the boxes for our priorities that we've said around reducing violent crime, which we have we have an ongoing process around this. This relates to affordable housing. This relates to the criminal justice reform. This relates to workforce development. This relates to new models of workforce development and skating to where the puck is going, not where it has been. I think there's ample evidence and ample studies out there to show that people that are not getting locked up for dealing with marijuana are not getting caught up in that cycle of recidivism. With that cycle of recidivism causes barriers to affordable housing, causes barriers to being employable. I think there's ample evidence to show the effects that all that, and we would be foolish to do our own studies if that evidence is already out here. This is something that is happening all over the country. We already have an infrastructure around historically, around tobacco in this state that would fit this. There is plenty of information out there to support this. And again, I think we should take the bold step because it hits so many of our priority areas directly.
Yes, Dana.
Yes, I just want to point out, it's my oversight of my part, but the 2 legislative initiatives from Mr. Alexander and Mr. Autry, neither one is eligible for consideration this year because it didn't meet the crossover timeline. And also, I don't know of any exemption from the no statewide bill moratorium for short sessions.
So,
Mr. Newton has
yeah, Mr. Newton.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to add, tax revenues touch on everything, right? I mean, at some point, that's more money that could be spent on funding transit projects, infrastructure, working with community partners, for workforce development, you name it.
Mr. Eccles.
Just that, all these points are valid, and I agree with all of them, but that's not really what we're debating, whether this should be on the legislative agenda because we think there's some chance to get some progress out of it. Clearly, if we could wave a magic wand and legalize marijuana, there'd be a lot of really positive benefits, all of which you've just enumerated, but there's not a chance of success here. And so that's why, again, I don't disagree with any of the points that are being made. It's just not really the debate that we're having.
Again, I see success as doing three things: starting, continuing, and completing a conversation, and we have the ability to start it.
Councilman Mitchell.
Yeah, so I'm gonna be very brief. I think a lot of the points that were made were excellent. I think for me, just speaking of someone who has not followed this legislation as well as Representative Cunningham, I think we need to do our own due diligence, though. And so if Councilman wants to say if there's studies out there to be done, I would like to see council to look at those studies, especially if you take those studies and you look at our hot spots. So I would like us to do some heavy lifting ourselves before I feel comfortable getting behind this type of legislation. I just think I'm always comfortable when people ask me the question why I'm doing something, that I have the data to be able to show them. And Councilman, so I think you're great for enlightening us, because I didn't know some study was already out there. So I would like to see us spend some time on this before we send this up to Raleigh.
Again, I would just ask, I think all of that is fair, and I think we could ask staff to get some of that information. Again, I would like for us as a committee to send this to the full council so we can have this discussion and consider this with more information as a body.
Can that information be compiled before?
I don't know the information that Mr. Winston is referring to.
I know, so during our discussion, well, the presentation on crime, particularly violent crime in our city, we were told that in as much as drug transactions or drugs are concerned in the relationship to violent crime, it is due in large, the vast majority of situations were the result of marijuana being included in this black market for marijuana. I do specifically recall that.
And I did ask staff to bring us information, so that process should have been started weeks ago.
Mr. Fenton, did you have another comment?
Nope.
Somebody have a motion?
All right,
A
is there a
motion to
motion?
send this marijuana legalization to the full council for consideration on our 2020 state legislative agenda.
Second. About the motion. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mitchell, did you have a question?
Yeah, just about the motion, but I hope the motion is more to, and also allow council to be educated.
Absolutely.
Not just send this back, because there's so much data out there that I think we need to look at, so I'm just not comfortable sending the motion. Well, go ahead. I just vote on principle. I'm sorry, Co-Chair, go ahead.
No, I completely agree with you. I don't think any of these should be given to council as, without some type of context, without some type of information about the relevant questions that council has, especially if there is information already out there. I think that's a completely fair consideration.
Councilman Eggleston.
Quick point of order before we vote. To Mr. Mitchell's point, not voting to add this to the legislative agenda in this committee today is not precluded from being brought up when we have the discussion at full council.
Nice. Okay, with that being said, we'll call it to question. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed?
Nay.
Nay.
Nays have it. Okay, moving on to the next item, minimum housing standards, city manager item. Dana, why don't you update us on that before we make a motion?
Yes, minimum housing standards, this was added to last year's legislative agenda. I think actually Mr. Winston brought it up at one of our meetings last year, or actually in the fall of 2018. An update on that is that legislation was filed by Representatives Beasley and Belk, and because it has an appropriation tied to it, which is to develop a standard for what level of harmful mold is, it is eligible for consideration this year in 2020.
Motion to include on the legislative agenda.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes. Finally, NC search and rescue teams, another city manager item.
Yeah, this was another item from 2019. An appropriation was included for this in both the House and Senate versions of the appropriations bill and in the final version that went to the governor for consideration. However, it's been caught up in the budget standoff between the governor and the General Assembly. So, and I know we've seen, and I provided last week a quotation from Senator Berger that he doesn't think there will be a budget adopted in 2020. We just don't know whether that's the case or not. So nonetheless, this is something that is needed, funding for local fire departments to provide these services.
Motion to include in the legislative agenda.
Second.
Any conversation? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? It passes. Great. So I've got just a quick item before we finish out.
Across the street.
Just hang on one sec. I might need you there. So I think as we go into the strategy session, we know what's on and what's not. We also know that items that were not passed forward, I think we might I'll put my head together with my co-chair, and I think we need to put a little structure behind how those get brought up, as in, not to limit anyone bring them up, but to give our colleagues and staff time to be able to go ask some questions, so they're not having to make a gut reaction at the end of the day. And so we'll come up with something that works on that. I have an item that I'm planning on bringing forth, whatever that process is, but I'll also bring it up now in case, and again, we've already mentioned it. I think the title would simply be North Carolina Criminal Justice System Reform. There is some work that still needs to be done, and it won't be even work that we will finish by that strategy session. Councilman Winston and I and several others are working on this on various fronts. We know one is our county's ability to on our own in a local bill be able to digitize certain files. We also know the challenges we face with Superior Court judges, both in the number we have and in the scheduling that are there. So there's a number of things that are there. My hope is that we can include this, because it would not be, in my opinion, a really good thing for us not, after the year we had last year, not have criminal justice reform on our legislative agenda somewhere. But I also know that all the work isn't done to populate that. So with that, I'll make a motion that we include it to populate more details, so at least we can get somewhere with the vote so it gets included in this go-round. But I do that and make that motion knowing that if this group isn't comfortable, I'll follow that same process to bring it forward to the council and hopefully have gotten a little more homework done there.
Are you making a motion?
I'm making a motion to include broader criminal justice reform, knowing that we need to figure out other items to populate, but knowing digitizing the records in Mecklenburg without having it a statewide requirement, and items that we've had looking at, like Superior Court judges in number and in scheduling.
Second.
Conversation? Dana, do you think, does anything about that, we've talked about this at length, does anything about that make you nervous?
A couple of things. One is that, again, it hasn't been populated, as you say, with what the exact
Right.
things are. Also, in terms of getting the other stakeholders in the process, or the other stakeholders to agree to something like this hasn't been done, as far as I know. And then of course, what Senator Berger had to say about the prospects for a 2020 state budget.
Right.
And also, I would just add too that, from my memory, is that it's around this time of the year, before a short session begins, is when the appropriators start to work on their budget request. And without something like that, it could be problematic. If we were to ask for it just go to our delegation and ask for it, it's probably too late.
Mr. Eggleston, I know you gotta leave, so.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I think this could also be, vote however we wanna vote, but I think this could also be brought back to the full council without coming out of committee, once there is more refinement around it, because again, from a principled standpoint, I think we shouldn't be sending things out of committee that we've not refined to some level of detail. And while I agree wholeheartedly with all those points, I think we need to outline them a little more clearly.
That's a fair point. I'll retract my motion. I think I want it to be voted on by full council, but I agree with that point. We can't send things out of here like that in that form. So I'll retract that.
Mr. Mitchell has
Mr. Mitchell, sorry.
And two co-chairs, I apologize, because I did not read my email, but you all said any items need to be added. So two co-chairs, I'm gonna follow your lead, and if we could visit veteran-owned business, I think the conversation we have had for years, how do we have veteran-owned business as an aspiration goal and a CBI? And so I'd like to have more conversation about that, because we all been
I will
passionate.
circle up with you, because
Okay.
we've had that conversation many times. I think that, I know Councilman Winston has one that he wants to bring forth, and then mine are probably three good ones for us to explore. And we'll just come up with a good process, so that, again, I think as long as we take the process of anyone can bring other things up that didn't make it out of this committee, but we got to figure out a way to get details about them in front of council members before the day of voting, where they're just not going to have much time to respond or react to it. Councilman Winston.
Newton. Yeah, I can see how you get us mixed up.
Totally.
Yeah.
Confused.
So 2 quick points. One, I just wanted to, for anyone watching, wanted to bring up, so we discussed this briefly during our last committee meeting regarding CRB subpoena power and its inability to be on this year's legislative agenda. You can refer back to that meeting, but basically, it's unable to be brought forward during this year's session. It was brought forward during last year's session, and I think it's going to be in our parking lot for the time being, right, Dana?
That's our recommendation, but for a slightly different reason, Mr. Newton.
Okay.
If you're going to put something forward, a local bill in this short session, you have to have all 17 members of your delegation sign on to it. I don't think we can get that. And also, it has to be non-controversial, and I know that this issue is controversial.
Okay, and then thank you for that clarification. And then second point is I wanted to repeat my request from last committee meeting too, for us to look at ways that we can work with our county partners on strategic mobility needs, particularly in the sphere of greenway corridors. And I think maybe more specifically to our Cross Charlotte trip.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Can I ask a question for clarification?
Sure.
Just to make sure I've got this right, because I have to get the materials ready for next week. As far as I can tell, what the committee's proposing on the state legislative agenda is to include the 3 city manager items: affordable housing, minimum housing standards, and NC search and rescue teams. Mm-hmm. But I'm unclear as to what actually the committee decided to do on local control.
So
I know
they
the vote was
decided to
3-2 in
bring
favor
forth local control.
as an agenda item?
Yes.
Okay.
Before the committee disbands, 2 things I do want us to discuss, not here today, but on a future agenda. One, I would like us to think about an intergovernmental strategy around the RNC. We will have a lot of folks here from different levels of government, different policymakers. I think this is a great opportunity for us as council members to engage different people from different parts of the country, different parts of the state that we wouldn't necessarily have access to. For instance, one of the things I brought up with this UIC funding, the chairperson behind that committee is Representative King from New York. Maybe there's an opportunity to show him why it's important that this region be pushed up in line to get some of this UIC funding. Again, what is our strategy, not from a political standpoint, but strictly from a city priority standpoint when we have all these different policymakers? I'd like for us to think about that. And secondly, I'd like us, Councilmember Co-Chair Bakar and I have had conversations. I think we need to come up with an intergovernmental strategy, period, for council on how we approach issues. We can't, every time that we have a zoning, ask how we get the school board involved, ask how we do this. I think we need to really, on a go-forward basis, city council members it should be common sense and part of our everyday occurrence that everybody has some type of intergovernmental responsibility, talking with different counterparts, right? Even with all 5 of us, if we just split up our 17-member local delegation in the State House, we probably couldn't talk to all of them every month and report back and then report out. So I would like for us to consider, how do we come up with a practice and policy that automates that throughout every policy process and every process that we have.
Yeah. And we've discussed this a bit. I'm in agreement that right now our intergovernmental approach is primarily centered around the federal and state legislative agendas each year. And we formulate them, we track them, we pitch them, and then we follow up, and then we start over again. I think there is a big open space that we've experienced over the last 2 years, from our county touch points, from Parks and Rec and Greenways, to our CMS touch point with rezoning decisions and knowing how it impacts schools, where that is all intergovernmental. So being more proactive, the question is, what does that process look like? Dana, perhaps you can take the lead in giving us your view in the meetings to come of how we might operationalize that a little more.
I'd be glad to. And also, one thing I do want to bring up with you right now is that I understand that Commissioner Jarrell from the county, who is the chair of the county's Intergovernmental Relations Committee has put out an invitation to this committee to have a joint meeting here in the next few months, especially talk about greenways and transportation.
Our last joint meeting was really good.
It was.
I think it was the starting point, and
Yes.
now we got a little comfortable. I think we picked some low-hanging fruit where we actually try to get something really done in the next one.
So would you like me to give me authority to work with my counterpart from the county, Star Latana, right back here?
Yes.
On putting together a
Absolutely.
joint meeting?
That'd be great.
So
That'd be
moved.
great.
All in favor?
Aye.
Don't believe we need to vote on that. All right.
Real close, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Does anyone else have any comments before we depart? Councilman Winston, can I have a motion?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
So moved.
All in favor? All right. Thank you.
Thank you, committee.